Welcome to the Paperless Productivity Podcast, where we have experts give you the insights, know-how, and resources to help you transform your workplace from paper to digital, while making your work life better at the same time.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Brad Smith, your host for today's podcast. Today's episode is the third installment of a three-part series discussing online dispute resolution. One organization, the National Center for State Courts, the NCSC, is an advocate for ODR movement. The National Center is a nonprofit organization charged with improving judicial administration in the United States and around the world. It functions as a think tank nonprofit consulting firm as well for the courts and a center of education in the field of judicial administration. I worked with these guys for 32 years and absolutely love what they do. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the National Center for State Courts' vision in 2021, considering the pandemic and what we're dealing with, and certainly beyond, because we know 2021 is just a precursor to the next few years as we move forward. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guests, good friends of mine, Paul Embley, CIO, and Diana Grasky, consultant with the National Center for State Courts. Hey, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Brad.
Hi, Brad.
Hey, and like I said, oh my gosh, I can't even believe it was like 2 years ago, almost this week, that we were all in Denver for an ODR summit in person, and I think that so much has changed, not only in 2019 but certainly in 2020. One of the questions I do have with you all is, considering the pandemic, have CIOs dealing with the pandemic, change their priorities towards ODR, or are they scrambling to get their people prepared for working remotely?
Yeah, Brad, that is such a great question. And the answer is certainly not what I anticipated going in. I thought that everybody would rush to ODR. But what's happened is there's almost been this bifurcation where some states, such as New Jersey, went all in and they said, wow, we had started this initiative, it's time to accelerate it. And they rolled out traffic in pretty lightning speed within a couple of months. And then you have other states where all of their IT resources, and which is true of every state, all of their IT resources were going into just keeping, technology going so that people could have virtual hearings, and whether that was just, cell phones and telephonic, or whether that was Zoom or WebEx or whatever it was. And so it really ended up being a mixed bag, much more so than we anticipated. If you had to look at the division, I would say more put their initiatives on pause than went forward. But those who went forward, they really embraced it and did things in pretty quick times.
And I would imagine that's the case. I would talk to other states and they're like, I'm just worried about getting laptops and setting up VPNs for our judges because they're not used to that. One of the questions I did have was, when you all receive calls, Di, since you're the consultant, and obviously, Paul, you're probably getting more IT calls, which stakeholders are actually reaching out to you guys? And when they do, because you would think that maybe clerks, and maybe IT, maybe court administrators or judges, but what information are they looking for when it comes to ODR?
Do you want to take that one first and then I'll weigh in?
Sure. A little bit of background perhaps first, Brad, if that's okay. Just very recently this winter, the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators met and really reiterated judicial leadership for the provision of remote services. So I do believe that there's good support for remote services from courts, but like Paul just pointed out, that doesn't necessarily mean online dispute resolution, right?
Right.
So when I think specifically about the kinds of assistance that our state and local court colleagues are looking for around online dispute resolution, I think that they are hoping that there's a repeatable process for, soup to nuts, from how do we select a case type to get started, what are the criteria that we should be thinking about, to, what can you do to help us with procurement, right? So we've
Right.
got a model RFP that we can make freely available to our court colleagues. Then, either before or after the selection of a vendor partner, our court colleagues have a series of really important design decisions to make. And so, what are the kinds of considerations that they should be thinking about when they decide whether it should be opt in or opt out, or whether it should include neutrals straight out of the gate, or wait a period of time, or let the parties request neutrals. I mean, so as you could, just a ton of design decisions that need to be made, and each of these has an impact on the success of the ODR initiative. And but Paul,
Right.
I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so Brad, your listeners may be familiar with this, you may be familiar with this, but the National Center for State Courts, in conjunction or partnership with the SJI, the State Justice Institute, has recently stood up some implementation labs. And one of those labs is around ODR. We have 6 jurisdictions who have requested assistance, and the people who have requested assistance have been a wide gamut of people. We have one who it's a county based, but the state is very interested in how this goes. We have another where it's a statewide effort. We have different case types. So we have the typical civil and traffic, but we also have the family cases. And then one of the ones that's really somewhat innovative that DI is involved in and that I'm anxiously following is what they're doing in Tennessee with the medical debt and having those cases come through ODR. And I think there's just such a wide variety that it's hard to say, oh, these are the typical people who want ODR. They can be law firms. I know that in one state, the bar is really pushing to have ODR be part of the offering. And, that's not the typical direction that, requests come from, but it is varied and wide.
Well, that's interesting because I know that when we were meeting a couple years ago, you had your family, your divorce, small claims, landlord tenant, and frankly, it would be considered low hanging fruit, and where you could see kind of a quick match of the technology. Are you seeing? You were talking about medical claims. Are you seeing other areas that are expanding, and are you getting like pings from state agencies, be it employment or it could be administrative agencies that are trying to, get an understanding or streamline some of their complaints as they move forward. And if so, are they using more private sector vendors or are they trying to go in house?
Yeah, so when we talk about the courts either have their own development staff and they typically develop everything in-house, or they are, go with the vendors, the COT solution. So when it's courts, that's what we talk about. We are starting to see an expansion though of ODR into some of those areas that you're talking about, administrative hearings. What was I trying to think of? But DI is involved in Iowa in their landlord-tenant, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Di.
Sure, this is a really interesting and we think innovative approach. Actually, the idea arose in Iowa before the pandemic hit, that they would like to offer an online dispute resolution service to landlords and tenants. Different jurisdictions call it different things, but in Iowa, it's forcible entry and detainer. Other jurisdictions might call it unlawful detainer. It's the eviction cases. right?
Uh,
And so before the pandemic, the Iowa Judicial Branch went to some stakeholder meetings and talked with landlords and tenant advocates. And what they learned from the landlords is that the timeline in most jurisdictions pre-pandemic for getting an eviction order was a matter of days. So
yeah,
it was very, very rapid. And so the landlords were very frank with the Iowa Judicial Branch and just said, if if you're going to offer us this online dispute resolution service after we've already filed, that is of no value to us. We believe we've done everything we can do to reach a good settlement with our tenant. This is the last straw as far as we're
right,
concerned. But if
right,
you push it upstream, if you offer us an online dispute resolution service as early in the beginning of a brewing dispute between a landlord and a tenant, that could actually offer us some value. Okay, then the pandemic hit. And
yeah,
as folks know, the landscape of eviction moratoria, of rental assistance programs, funding, the Center for Disease Control. I mean, it shifts weekly over the past year and will probably continue to shift rapidly. And so now Iowa is envisioning their landlord tenant ODR as a way of matching landlords and tenants not only with legal information, but also with community resources and up-to-date information about programs that might be available. So I think that's just really interesting application of an ODR platform.
And Brad, I wanted to piggyback onto that, just to emphasize that what Di was saying is that this is pre-filing, which is typically not where courts have gone in the past, but it's one of those things that I think the courts are going to need to think about and consider when when do we get involved in legal disputes? Do we only wait until somebody comes to our doorstep, or do we have some responsibility to provide information or even some platforms to people to try to work through their dispute and try to get it resolved before we even go to court? And I know there's a lot of thought that's been put into that out in the academic world, but now courts are starting to face that and say, when does our involvement in disputes begin?
Right. Can courts play a role in dispute avoidance or dispute minimization, or however you want to say it? This concept of intervening upstream and helping the parties find the resources or the information or the mediation or whatever services might cause that dispute from getting bigger.
right. I have so many questions. I mean, because everything you brought up, Di, you're mentioning, we have you have a kind of one side good cop, the other side of bad cop. It's interesting because you certainly want to be ahead of the curve. And in the two jurisdictions you brought up, which were Iowa, which is a statewide proprietary case management system, as well as New Jersey, a statewide proprietary case management system, and I could see certainly the advantages of in terms of volume that is coming into the courts and staffing the backlog, which may have been caused by the pandemic. On the other hand, I can also see that there are some jurisdictions that rely on statutory fees. The state of Louisiana, for example, their clerks are not funded by the state, and so if you gave them a you know, pre-contact to the courts, they're not filing a statutory fee. They're solving the dispute prior to that, and so that gets into a whole new thing in terms of funding. I mean, like, we
Mm-hmm.
certainly want to create access to justice. It's been a mantra that we've had for years. But we also understand the realization that if you don't have funding and you're not, and unfortunately, the judiciary is always like 1% or less than 1% of the state's budget, then the reality is, how do we how do we move forward and how do we keep these systems up and running?
Yeah.
Well, Brad, go ahead, Ty.
Oh, okay. But Paul, I hope you don't forget your thought either. This brings to mind our colleagues in Ottawa County, Michigan, who have been real pioneers in the use of online dispute resolution for child support enforcement
Yep.
cases. And Brad, I understand not every state or not every county considers child support enforcement a judicial function. Many of them, it's a purely administrative function, and I get that. But in Ottawa County, the courts play a big role in child support enforcement. And so, what our court colleagues I think have been brilliant about funding is they are finding partners like the sheriff's department, who absolutely do feel the brunt of having to serve arrest warrants for failure to pay child support and would have to, pay to hold somebody in custody. Or, there are federal grant opportunities where jurisdictions are rewarded financially from federal health and human services department for achieving certain thresholds in child support enforcement collection. So there are ways of thinking about funding streams that are separate from court filing fees.
Another point, Brad, that I was going to make, and I appreciate Di pointing to, alternative ways of thinking about things. We need to really be paying attention to the world beyond our ecosystem. And when we look at what has disruption done to these other industries, I'm going to use news as an example, where technology took, for most people, took away that home delivery of the newspaper, and now the delivery comes via the web. But people in the news industry are scrambling, saying, how do we pay for this? How, and they're looking at working different deals and figuring that out. Courts are not going to be immune. We've been able to hide behind, well, we are the only people out there who can resolve a dispute. Well, people are finding other ways to resolve disputes because of the lack of access and so forth. And so we need to be paying attention to how are others solving this, and getting ahead of the game, instead of thinking, oh, we're immune from this and it's just not going to happen. And so hopefully courts would be looking at how to work with their legislative bodies and to their other funding sources and say, we have some opportunities here. Let's rethink the way that we, we kind of have to use air quotes, but how do we pay, or how do we fund this whole justice system? Because, maybe the way that we've been doing funding is not sustainable long term, but it also could lead to new opportunities.
Yeah, I
Sure.
could not agree more, Paul. And Brad, if I could just pile on what Paul's saying right now, I think about the bookmobile, right? So public libraries, probably decades ago, figured out that you could have a van and put some books in it and have a schedule where you actually go out to the people and provide them with library services where they are, right? And
Right.
then, there was kind of the food truck idea, right? So food trucks as an option to restaurants. Well, now the pandemic, over the past year, look at how that model of taking your service out to the people who need it rather than demanding that they come to your big box. We see that with animal shelters going out to do immunizations or neuter surgery. We see food banks setting up, free lunch programs for kids at their neighborhood schools, rather than making people come to the actual big box food bank. There are so many examples: breast cancer screenings, mobile dental clinics. immunizations now, COVID immunizations, actually taking it to the people. What if, if courts really embrace that idea, what could they do if they were freed from that big box idea like these other service providers? It's exciting.
And Brad, you've got us going on something we're passionate about, and ODR is part of that. But there's a judge in Salt Lake City who, right at the beginning of the pandemic, said, "You know what? I have an RV. I'm going to go out and I'm going to have people come to court, and you can." And he goes in his RV, and it's painted and all that, and he's hearing court, there on street side, doing the social distancing and all that. Well, that same judge said, now wait a minute, where do we have a lot of legal issues? We have it in these homeless cities, or homeless towns,
Yeah.
the places where everybody gathers. Well, so now he has set up a tent, in the middle of this tent city, that is court, and he's taking care of warrants, he's taking care of, all of these legal issues that people who are, in this stage of life who need this help, he's going out to them. And so ODR is just yet another means we have of going out to people. And when you tie ODR into, portals and being able to discover what options you might have, what remedies may be available to you, all of a sudden we're becoming that mobile clinic that is going to people and no longer making them make that trek into our courthouse.
Again, you guys, I'm like freaking out here because I have so many different questions because I believe the brick and mortar courthouse of the past is becoming less and less of a priority. And once the courts kind of figure out that that is the case, and then of course we've started going into technologies aside from ODR, and we can broaden our horizon, not only ODR, but it's technology in general, and how do multiple technology solutions kind of collaborate or blend. So for example, you have online dispute resolution, but then there's a lot of people that just automatically went to Zoom, and whether or not it's GoToMeeting or WebEx or Teams, but Zoom
Hmm.
became kind of the quick thing of choice. Now, can you blend? And some people thought that was ODR, it's just because of accessibility. But then again, if you could blend Zoom technology with ODR, or even take it up a notch, we recently have had some discussions with a company called Philo that kind of blends a dashboard approach on top of Zoom, which then allows you to have collaboration private. So you could have the defendant, you could have the prosecuting attorney, the public defender, the judge, all of them being able to exchange information individually in a secure environment, and then come back together and have a conclusion to whatever that issue may be. What are your thoughts on Zoom and ODR as we move forward?
Well, I love what Alaska's vision is, and I think that will become a shared vision with many other states. But Alaska, they love to joke that they've been doing social distancing since they were made a state. So,
So true.
but they see it as a continuum. They see people coming into ODR and trying to resolve their case there, and then if they can't get to a resolution, then why not have that same platform allow for a video hearing? Whether that's a tie into Zoom or whether it's, another solution that's tied in, but why not have that entire continuum so that naturally, if people need to come to a court because they don't have technology, or they don't feel comfortable using technology, whatever, we need to still have that option. And what we're talking about here is just expanding the array of options that people would have, and being able to, come in via technology and continue to use that if that's what they're comfortable with, or come in physically to a courthouse and continue that way, or why not have the ability to move between the two depending on the circumstance? So absolutely, Brad, I think that that is the future of where we're going to end up with in terms of where ODR can lead us, and at the same time continuing to provide additional options in how people can resolve their disputes.
Absolutely, Paul. I can remember hearing the story at the International ODR Forum that the National Center for State Courts hosted in Williamsburg. Gosh, was that a year and a half ago? It feels like forever ago. It's a very large, geographically large rural county in Arizona that had dipped its toe in online dispute resolution and online mediation for family cases. But what their neutrals were experiencing was a real slow adoption rate.
Right.
And what they kind of figured out is that if they put some personal, like a phone call or a video conference up front, even before the parties were invited to join the ODR platform, their rates of adoption went way up because suddenly these were real people really trying to help, and it wasn't scary anymore. It was
Right.
legitimate. So we can see that happening too, where some of these video conferencing technologies could help assist ODR adoption rates by establishing some personal relationships and trust ahead of time. And then, folks feel more comfortable just doing the asynchronous chat and the document sharing and the other kinds of things we think about in an ODR platform.
When we talk to courts, I mean, we all know they all want to look into technology, dip their toe into technology, but they don't want to be bleeding edge. Um, it freaks people out, and they're like, okay, so in terms of precedence, like, hey, I don't mind being second or third. Let the first or second jurisdiction go through the growing pains, for lack of a better term. But have we seen? Is there certain jurisdictions, be it California, New Jersey, Iowa, Utah, have we seen some kind of best in practice in being able to note that and say, yeah, they did it unbelievably well, and we believe your jurisdiction falls into similar category? I mean, do we have that kind of noted and prepped up, or is that something that's kind of an ongoing approach?
I think it is ongoing, Brad, but we do have some lessons learned. And you tell Paul and me whether it's possible for you to share a lessons learned ODR document with folks who choose to listen to this podcast.
Yes. I mean, all right, I'm throwing this out there because I'm in a consultant role. The whole idea of what we do with these podcasts is to be vendor neutral. I mean, we're here to help. The more
Hmm.
education, the more ability to get the word out has always been my drive in this industry. There's no reason in the world that someone would just commit themselves to 32 years of government if they didn't love it. And I've always felt like the collaboration between the national center and or vendors. Some people look at vendors as, oh, they're just trying to make money, but the whole idea is we're also trying to help individuals in the industry, and we truly love it. And so yes, I would suggest that anyone that listens to this podcast can reach out to you and Paul and get the right information at the right time.
So there is the Joint Technology Committee has
Yep.
put together a number of resources, and people can easily find that by going to ncsc.org/JTC. And if you look at the publication section, there's some case studies on ODR. There's judicial perspectives on ODR and a number of other great resources. But back to your question, Brad, one of the things that I've observed is that there are a number of really good implementations, but the commonality between them all is that they have had an individual who is absolutely passionate about ODR. And it doesn't, in Utah, it is one of the justices from the Supreme Court. In
Yep.
Ohio, it is court administrator, and you go to various places, and that is to me more indicative of whether or not you are going to have a stellar ODR implementation or not. It's that passion and that drive, because those people will continue to improve that. They may start out with something that is less than perfect, but we always talk about a minimally viable product. Get it out there and then let it evolve. But those people continue to refine that and continue to better that product. So there are some great examples that are out there, but more importantly, yeah, I would look to the examples of those people who have been passionate about it.
Yeah, I always feel like, and it's just as any, considering all the years, whether or not it was electronic legal research or e-filing or electronic dashboards for judges, you always have to have your champions, someone that's talkative enough, and it's always easier to share. I mean, one, you all have the advantage of being a national center. Two, it's always great having a peer-to-peer conversation for someone that's passionate. And so it doesn't appear from an outsider that a vendor is trying to sell them something versus trying to assist people and make their lives easier. And I think that that's one of the, that's the fine line. I mean, how do you leverage technology or ODR to make everyone's lives easier, whether or not you're a neutral attorney, judge, clerk, in that respect?
Yeah. I think I would also add that we've got some folks in the judicial space who are really passionate about the user experience and engaging with users and really putting them first.
Right.
And it's super important. Brad and Paul, did you guys happen to see that funny video last week of the user testing with the little blocks? You're putting them in different slots, and the user figured out that all of the different shape blocks would all go through one slot, and the developers just crying, basically. We in the court sometimes create too much of an echo chamber. We're designing systems that on the face of things are for our constituents, for our residents, but we never ask them what they want, and we never ask them for their feedback about how well it's working for them. So but I do see that there being a change in that thinking, and there are some very zealous advocates for user testing in the ODR space, but in court technology more generally, right?
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. And as a matter of fact, I wanted to thank you guys for all your time. I mean, you guys are, your favorites in my book regardless, and I really appreciate your guys' time.
Well, thank you, Brad. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Brad, and your colleagues for helping to bring some of these visions to fruition.
Cheers, guys. If you haven't already done so, download part 1 and part 2 of the ODR series. If you would like to learn more about the opportunities online dispute can bring to your court system or practice, we encourage you to visit our ODR specific website, www.resolvedisputes.com, for an expanded walkthrough and/or to request a demo. This concludes our podcast today. Thanks and have a great day.
To learn more about ImageSoft, please visit imagesoftinc.com. That's imagesoftinc.com. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to Paperless Productivity, where we tackle some of the biggest paper-based pain points facing organizations today. We'll see you next time.